Hello everyone, welcome to my class. Myself Janisha from Sciences of Composite PU College, Vijaypur. In the last class we have discussed about the Indian economy, that is during the reforms period. Yes, so in that we came to know about the contribution of service sector, GDP, and also slow growth of agriculture sector and fluctuations in the industrial sector. So today in this episode we are going to discuss about criticism of reforms, that is in few areas. Some of the scholars, they argued that, they criticized that introduction of reforms period which will not cover all the areas and which will not solve the basic problems. Discuss about those areas. Criticism of reforms in few areas, that is in the areas of employment, agriculture, industry, infrastructure development and fiscal management. In these areas, what the reforms will not make any kind of changes. Then let me discuss one by one. Growth and employment. Though the GDP growth rate has increased in the reform period, as we know that GDP growth rate has increased, and scholars pointed out that reform-led growth has not generated sufficient employment opportunities in the country. That means GDP has been increased, but what about the employment opportunities? It will not sufficient to fulfill the employment opportunities. So that is the reason scholars criticized by the reform period. Next one, reforms in agriculture. Reforms have not been able to benefit agriculture also, where the growth rate has been decelerating. Here, public investment in agriculture sector, especially in infrastructure, which includes irrigation, power, roads, market linkages and research and extension, it should be fallen in the reform period. So which played crucial role in green revolution, but after the introduction of reform policies, so this what infrastructure of agriculture, so it will not be developed properly. Further, the partial removal of fertilizer subsidy has led to increase in the cost of production. That means the partial removal of fertilizer subsidy, so which will create or increase the cost of production, and which has also severely affected the small and marginal farmers. And also this sector has been experiencing a number of policy changes, such as reduction in import duties on agricultural products, low minimum support price and lifting of quantitative restrictions on the imports of agricultural products. That means during this reform period, agriculture sector has been experiencing a number of policy changes. There is number of policies has been changed, that is regarding the reduction in import duties on agriculture products, low minimum support price, okay, and also lifting the quantitative restrictions on the imports of agricultural products, and also it adversely affect on again small peasants. These have adversely affected Indian farmers as they now have to face increased international competition. So this will adversely affect on Indian farmers, and also they now face international competition. Moreover, because of export-oriented policy strategies, not only this, export-oriented policy strategies, that is in agriculture, there has been a shift from production for the domestic market towards production for the export market, focusing on cash crops in lieu of production of food grains. That means here, what, due to the export oriented policy, so which encourage the cash crops, not a domestic market, not a domestic products. As a result, a small farmers again they'll face the international competition, and also this puts pressure on the prices of food grains. Now let me see here reforms in industry. Then what are the reforms in industry? Industrial growth has also recorded a slowdown, fluctuated because of decreasing demand of industrial products due to various reasons. Means what? The low demand of industrial products such as cheaper imports, inadequate investment in infrastructure. For this reason, the demand of industrial products has been decreases. In a globalized world, developing countries are compelled to open up their economies to greater flow of goods and capital from developed countries and rendering their industries vulnerable to imported goods. That means in a globalized world, because you know that already high competition. So here developing countries are compelled to open up their economies to greater flow of goods and capital. That is from what? Developed countries only. And also they rendering their industries vulnerable to imported goods. And cheaper imports have thus replaced the demand for domestic goods. So that cheaper imports, so that will be cause for the replacement of demand for domestic goods. Now the domestic manufacturers are facing competition from imports, and the infrastructure facilities including power supply have remained inadequate due to lack of investment. Now the investors, they are not ready to invest money, and also due to this what? Including power supply, lack of inadequate power supply. So this will cause the low production and this will affect the domestic manufacturers. Thus globalization is often seen as creating conditions for the free movement of goods and services from foreign countries, and that adversely affect the local industries and employment opportunities in developing countries. So that as a result, means the globalization, so which will encourage or creating the conditions for the free movement of goods and services from one country to another country, and but it is adversely effect on the local industries, employment opportunities in the developing countries. Moreover, a developing country like India still does not have the access to developed countries' markets because of high non-tariff barriers. That means due to high non-tariff barriers from developed countries, so developing countries like India has not what? Access to market. Take for example, although all quota restrictions on exports of textiles and clothing have been removed in India, USA has not removed their quota restriction on import of textiles from India and China. See here, India has been removed all the import restrictions, quotas, okay, but USA has not removed their quota restrictions on import of textiles from India and China. So this is what we can observe, that as a result our industrial sector has been declined. Next, disinvestment. Every year the government fixes a target for disinvestment of public sector enterprises. For instance, in 1991 to 92, it was targeted to mobilize rupees 2,500 crore through disinvestment. And also the government was able to mobilize 3,040 crore more than the target. In 2017-18, the target was about 1 lakh crore, whereas the achievement was about 1,57 crore. And here critics pointed out that the assets of public sector enterprises have been undervalued and sold to the private sector. So this overmobilization of what the target, so the over mobilization of what investment, so this will affect on the private sector. This means that there has been a substantial loss to the government. Moreover, the proceeds from disinvestment are used to offset the shortage of government revenues rather than using it for the development of public sector enterprises and building social infrastructure in the country. So that this disinvestment or high mobilization of capital, so this is what huge loss to the government, and it is also effect on the what development of the economy. Next we'll see reforms and fiscal policies. Economic reforms have placed limits on the growth of public expenditure, especially in social sector. The tax reductions in the reform period aimed at yielding larger revenue and curb tax evasion have not resulted in increase in tax revenue for the government. So this tax revenue or this tax system, so this also not affected through the reform period. Also, the reform policies involving tariff reduction have curtailed the scope for raising revenue through custom duties. So, in order to attract foreign investment, means to attraction of or influence of the foreign investment, tax incentives are provided to foreign investors, and which further reduce the scope for raising tax revenues. That means tax concession or tax incentives that is provided to foreign investors, so this will reduce the scope for raising the tax revenues, and this has a negative impact on developmental and welfare expenditures. Now we'll conclude this chapter. Thus, the process of globalization through liberalization and privatization policies has produced positive as well as negative results both for India and other countries. That means positive results also there, again negative results also there. Some scholars argue that globalization should be seen as an opportunity in terms of greater access to global markets, high technology, and increased possibility of large industries of developing countries to become important players in the international arena. That means some of the scholars, they argued that globalization, it is one of the opportunity to global market or a greater market, and it is a positive sign for high technology, and it increases the possibility of large industries of developing countries, and it is one of the important players in the international arena. So this is what the argument of some of the scholars. So this is what this policy reforms, LPG or liberalization, privatization and globalization. Okay students, so now this chapter is wind up. So in the next episode we'll start new chapter. So in this episode also some exercise questions there. Question number 1, write a short note on reforms in fiscal policy. Question number 2, what is disinvestment? Question number 3, write a short note on reforms in agriculture. So these are the questions you need to solve the answer and submit it on time. Thank you.